She was beaten and left to die until a cowboy found her and pulled her back to life. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold. The wind whispered across the sand, carrying with it the faint scent of sagebrush and dry earth. In the distance, a small homestead sat alone, its wooden planks weathered by years of sun, wind, and occasional storms. It was a place that seemed almost forgotten, where time slowed and the world beyond felt far away. A woman walked steadily toward it, her boots kicking up tiny clouds of dust with every step. She was tired, her clothes dusty and worn, but there was a determination in her eyes that no desert could erase. She had traveled for days between settlements, carrying with her the weight of her own story and the simple, urgent need for water. The sun had been merciless that day, but the thought of reaching the well kept her moving. As she approached, the figure of a man appeared near the edge of the porch. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in worn denim and a faded hat that shaded his eyes. His face was lined, not just from age, but from years of solitude and hardship. He moved slowly, his every step careful, like a man used to watching the world from a distance. In his hand he held a rifle, not in menace, but as a habit of survival. He had learned long ago that the desert did not forgive mistakes. When their eyes met, there was a moment of quiet tension. She stopped a few feet away, instinctively aware of the caution in his stance. "I'm just here for water," she said, her voice calm but steady. The man nodded slowly, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. There was a wariness in him, a habit formed over years of living alone. Strangers were rare, and trust rarer still. "Get water from the well," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "And leave by dawn." There was no warmth in them, no invitation. They were a boundary, a line drawn clearly in the sand. She nodded, understanding perfectly. The desert was a place of rules, even unspoken ones, and ignoring them could be dangerous. She moved toward the well, her boots crunching against the gravel. The wooden structure was old but sturdy, with a bucket that hung from a rope frayed at the edges. She dropped it in and let it sink until she felt the cool touch of water. Lifting the bucket slowly, she drew up a measure of life, the liquid catching the fading sunlight and sparkling like a small treasure. The man watched her from the porch, silent but alert. There was something in his gaze that made her aware of his solitude. He was a man who had lived too long without companionship, who had learned the hard lessons of survival and distance. And yet, despite his gruff warning, there was a sense of responsibility in him. He knew the desert could be unforgiving, and he had seen enough to understand that sometimes even strangers deserved a chance. As she filled her containers, the wind shifted, carrying a cloud of dust that made her blink and cough. He stepped closer, not threatening, but steadying himself against the breeze. "Careful," he said. "Storms can come fast out here. You don't want to be caught in one." She gave a small smile, appreciating the warning, and continued her task. Water was precious, and she had learned to move quickly and efficiently. She filled her containers to the brim, the rhythmic motion of lifting and lowering the bucket grounding her in the task. For a moment, the world outside the homestead seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of the rope creaking, the water sloshing, and the distant call of a hawk circling above. Once she had gathered enough, she sat on the edge of the well to rest, letting the weight of her journey settle for a moment. The man leaned against the porch, still watching her, still quiet. She noticed that he did not move to intervene or challenge her. His presence was steady, almost protective, though it carried no words of comfort. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked finally, breaking the silence, her voice soft, not meant to intrude but to fill the emptiness around them. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing the honesty of her question. "Some things," he said slowly, "you learn to handle yourself. Some things are easier alone." There was no bitterness in his voice, just a quiet acceptance. The desert had shaped him, hardened him, and taught him lessons he carried silently. He had seen people come and go, some kind, some cruel, and he had learned that solitude, while heavy, could also be a shield. She nodded, understanding more than he might have realized. She, too, had faced a world that demanded caution and self-reliance. But in this small, sunlit moment by the well, there was a fragile connection between them, unspoken but real. Two people, strangers to each other, sharing a space where survival and humanity met. The wind picked up again, rattling the boards of the porch and carrying a hint of evening chill. She gathered her containers, making sure the lids were secure, the water safe for the journey ahead. He stepped aside, giving her the path back to the trail. There was a silent acknowledgement between them, a mutual respect for boundaries and effort. Before she left, she glanced back. For a brief moment, she saw the lines of loneliness etched on his face soften slightly. There was no invitation, no promise, just a fleeting recognition of shared endurance. And in the vast, empty desert, that was enough. As she walked away, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of purple and red across the sky. The man watched her go, the porch creaking under the settling wooden boards. The desert around him was silent, yet in that silence was a strange companionship, the kind that came from witnessing another person's resilience, from sharing even a brief moment of connection without words. The night settled in, cool and quiet, with stars scattered like tiny lanterns across the sky. The homestead stood alone, as it always had, but the presence of the woman left a subtle mark, a reminder that, even in isolation, human lives intersected in small but meaningful ways. The cowboy returned to his routine, tending to his small garden and feeding the few animals he kept, the echo of their brief meeting lingering in his mind. And somewhere down the trail, the woman rested for the night, the water safely stored, her thoughts carrying a mixture of relief, gratitude, and curiosity. The desert was harsh, but moments like this reminded her that even in solitude and danger, kindness could exist, fleeting as it might be. She drifted to sleep under the wide open sky, knowing she had fulfilled her task and that for a few hours, two lives had briefly crossed paths in a way that neither would forget. The desert morning arrived slowly, with the sun peeking over the horizon in pale streaks of pink and gold. The woman had already begun her journey, walking steadily along the narrow trail that led away from the homestead. Her containers of water were balanced carefully on her shoulders, the weight heavy but manageable. Every step kicked up small clouds of dust that shimmered in the early light, and the wind whispered softly, carrying the dry, earthy scent of the desert. Behind her, the cowboy watched from the edge of his porch, leaning against the railing. His hat shaded his eyes from the rising sun, but he could see her clearly, moving with purpose. There was something in the way she carried herself, quiet strength, careful determination, that reminded him of himself when he was younger, before solitude had taught him caution and reserve. As the woman walked, she noticed the world around her slowly waking. A lizard scuttled across a sun-warmed rock. A few birds called to each other from the branches of a distant tree, and the wind carried the faint smell of wildflowers blooming in secret pockets of the desert. She took it all in, letting herself feel the beauty even in the harshness of the landscape. Every day here was a lesson in survival, but also a reminder of the quiet wonders that often went unnoticed. Her thoughts drifted back to the cowboy. She could not help but remember his warning from the night before: get water from the well and leave by dawn. At first it had sounded harsh, almost unfriendly, but now she understood it differently. It was not anger or cruelty in his voice. It was caution, and maybe even care. He knew the desert, and he knew how dangerous it could be for someone traveling alone. That brief encounter had been more than just a transaction. It had been a moment of understanding between two people from very different worlds. The path she followed began to wind through a small canyon where shadows stretched long and cool across the ground. She slowed her pace, aware of the sudden change in terrain. The canyon walls rose steep and jagged, casting dark shapes that seemed to move with the wind. Here, the desert felt more alive, more unpredictable. Small rocks crumbled under her boots, and the echoes of her footsteps bounced back at her. She stayed alert, remembering the cowboy's quiet vigilance by the well. As she moved deeper into the canyon, she heard a faint rustle above her. Looking up, she saw a hawk circling high in the sky, its sharp eyes scanning the ground. The sight gave her a strange sense of comfort. Nature, in its own way, seemed to be watching over her. She had learned to read these signs, small hints of safety and danger alike. The desert was a teacher, and she was willing to learn its lessons. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher, heating the rocks and sand beneath her feet. Sweat ran down her back, and the water she carried felt heavier with every step. She paused occasionally to rest, taking small sips from her personal bottle and letting the cool liquid refresh her. Even in exhaustion, she felt a sense of pride. The journey was not easy, but she was capable. She had faced challenges before, and she would face them again. Suddenly she heard the sound of movement not far off the trail. Her heart quickened, and she instinctively paused, scanning the rocks and brush for the source. A small group of travelers emerged from behind a bend, a family, moving cautiously, carrying their own supplies. They nodded to her briefly, and she nodded back, feeling the silent camaraderie of people who understood the hardships of life in the desert. For a moment, she allowed herself a small smile. In the midst of isolation, moments of connection, even brief ones, were precious. The trail soon widened, leading her to a shallow riverbed that had long since dried. The cracked earth stretched in jagged patterns, evidence of the water that had once flowed freely here. She stopped and knelt, brushing away the dust to examine the ground. In the tiny depressions, she could see remnants of water, hidden and almost forgotten. This was a place where survival required attention to detail and patience. She collected a small amount for herself, careful not to waste a single drop, and continued on her way. By mid-afternoon, the sun was blazing high, and the heat became nearly unbearable. She found a small, shaded area beneath a cluster of rocks and rested, leaning against a cool stone. She drank more water and allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment. Memories of the cowboy's solitary homestead drifted back to her mind, and she wondered what it would be like to live there, to be alone yet connected to the land in such a raw and honest way. She imagined the quiet evenings, the long nights under the stars, and the rhythm of life that moved with the desert rather than against it. After a brief rest, she rose and continued. The trail began to climb gradually, winding through rolling hills of sand and stone. Her legs ached, but she pushed forward, focusing on the path ahead. The desert was demanding, but it was also a place of clarity. Every step required attention. Every decision mattered, and every moment was real. She liked that honesty, even if it was harsh. As the afternoon waned, she noticed a change in the wind. It carried the faint smell of smoke and wood, and she paused to consider the possibility of another homestead or camp. She approached cautiously, aware that not all encounters in the desert were friendly. As she crested a small ridge, she saw a figure tending to a small fire. The person looked up, and she realized it was not a stranger. It was the cowboy. He had followed the trail from his homestead, moving quietly and deliberately, his eyes alert to the landscape. She was surprised, but not afraid. There was a sense of familiarity now, a recognition of each other's skill and resilience. "You didn't have to follow me," she said, her voice steady. "I wanted to make sure you were safe," he replied simply. His tone had softened, lacking the rough edge of the night before. There was no warning this time, only presence. It was a rare thing for him to show care without words, to offer protection without demanding gratitude. They sat together near the fire, sharing a simple meal of bread and dried fruit. There was no rush, no pretense, just two people taking a brief pause in the midst of a long journey. The conversation was quiet, stories exchanged in careful, measured tones. She spoke of her travels, of the settlement she had visited, of the people she had met. He spoke of the desert, of his solitude, of the lessons he had learned from the land and from life. As evening fell, the sky turned deep purple, dotted with stars that seemed closer here than anywhere else. The air cooled, and the wind carried a soft hush across the desert. They worked together to secure the fire, to prepare their small camp for the night. There was a rhythm to their actions, an unspoken cooperation that grew from mutual respect. In the harshness of the desert, this simple companionship was a rare and valuable thing. When night fully settled, they sat quietly, the fire crackling softly between them. She noticed a softness in him she had not seen before, a vulnerability, perhaps, or a moment of trust. He did not speak, and neither did she. Words were not necessary. In the vast stillness of the desert, presence itself was enough. She thought of the journey that still lay ahead. The path would not be easy, and she would face many more challenges before reaching safety. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of reassurance. They were both travelers in their own ways, one seeking water and survival, the other seeking solitude and understanding. And for a brief time their paths had intersected, offering something neither of them had expected: companionship in the quiet desert. As sleep approached, she reflected on the cowboy's initial warning. It had not been harshness or distrust. It had been concern, expressed in the only way he knew. And she understood that now. Life in the desert required caution, respect, and awareness, but it also allowed moments of connection, however fleeting. She felt grateful for this unexpected bond, a reminder that even in isolation, human kindness could exist. The fire burned low, and the stars shone brightly overhead. The desert night was alive with subtle sounds: the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the quiet hum of the earth itself. She closed her eyes, letting the calm of the night settle over her, and allowed herself to feel a quiet hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight there was safety, there was understanding, and there was the strange comfort of shared experience. And in the distance, the cowboy watched over the camp, a silent guardian. He remained vigilant, aware of the desert's dangers, yet strangely at ease. For once, he did not feel completely alone. The presence of another human being, even one he barely knew, had shifted the stillness of his world. It was a small but meaningful change, a reminder that life could be endured more gracefully when shared, even briefly. The desert morning came suddenly, sharp and hot. The sun rose quickly, casting long, bright streaks across the rocks and sand. The woman and the cowboy woke early, aware that the heat would grow fierce as the day progressed. She felt the weight of the water she carried on her back, heavy but necessary, while he moved about with a quiet efficiency, preparing for the day. There was an unspoken understanding between them now. They no longer needed to exchange formal words or warnings. Their brief time together had built a silent respect, one that was based on survival, patience, and shared understanding of the desert's dangers. Yet, beneath the calm surface, both knew that the desert was unpredictable. One small mistake could turn a simple journey into a struggle for life. They packed what they could carry and set off together along the winding trail. The path led through a narrow canyon where shadows moved and shifted with the rising sun. The woman noticed the sharp edges of the rocks, the way the sand slipped under her boots, and the occasional tumbleweed rolling past like it had a purpose. The cowboy walked beside her, steady and cautious, eyes scanning the horizon and the cliffs above. He had a sixth sense for danger, honed by years of solitary living, and it was as though the desert spoke to him in quiet warnings. As they moved deeper into the canyon, the wind changed. It was faint at first, a gentle rustle, but then it grew stronger, sweeping dust and sand into small, swirling storms. The woman raised her arm to shield her face, squinting as grains of sand stung her cheeks. The cowboy stopped immediately, gesturing for her to wait behind a large rock outcropping. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice low and calm. "We need cover." She nodded, hurrying to the shelter of the rock. He followed, positioning himself between her and the canyon walls, scanning the area for danger. The desert could turn against travelers in an instant, and he had learned to respect it without fear, but always with caution. She watched him, noting the way he moved, deliberate and careful, like a man who understood both the beauty and the danger of the land. The wind rose quickly, carrying sand and dust that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. They crouched behind the rock, waiting for the worst of it to pass. The storm moved with surprising speed, gusts whipping through the canyon and rattling loose stones. At one point, a small rock tumbled down from above, landing near their feet with a loud clatter. They flinched, hearts racing, but neither was hurt. While they waited, the woman spoke quietly. "I didn't expect to face a storm this soon," she said. The cowboy shook his head. "You learn to expect anything out here. The desert doesn't follow rules. It doesn't care who you are or what you need. You just have to adapt." She nodded, taking in his words. There was a strange wisdom in his voice, shaped by years of solitude and survival. He didn't speak of fear or hardship with bitterness, only with recognition of reality. She realized that this was why he had survived here so long. He knew the land, its moods, and its dangers, and he respected it rather than trying to fight it. Gradually, the wind began to die down, leaving behind a fine layer of dust over the canyon floor. The sky cleared, and the sunlight returned, though it was harsh and bright now. They stepped out from behind the rock, brushing sand from their clothes and boots. The storm had passed, but the desert remained unforgiving, and the weight of their journey pressed on them both. They continued along the trail, moving cautiously. The woman noticed that the cowboy occasionally paused to inspect the ground, marking tracks of animals or signs of movement that most travelers would miss. His knowledge of the desert was remarkable. She felt a growing admiration for his skill, and perhaps a quiet trust that she had not felt with strangers before. Hours later, as the sun climbed high and the heat became nearly unbearable, they reached a narrow ridge overlooking a small valley. From this vantage point, the desert spread out endlessly, a mix of sand, rocks, and distant mesas. But their relief at the view was short-lived. In the distance, she saw movement, figures moving steadily toward them, kicking up dust in the heat. "Bandits!" the cowboy muttered, his voice tense but controlled. His hand moved to the rifle slung across his back, not in panic, but in readiness. The woman's heart raced. She had heard stories of travelers being ambushed in the desert, and now it seemed that story could become reality. He gestured for her to stay low behind the ridge. "We can't outrun them, not in the open," he said quietly. "We'll need to be smart about this." The woman nodded, gripping her water containers tightly. Fear was present, but so was determination. She had survived harsh conditions before, and now she would survive this challenge too. They crouched behind the ridge, watching the figures move closer, calculating the distance and speed. The cowboys scanned the terrain, looking for potential escape routes or places to hide. Time seemed to stretch. Each movement of the bandits was visible, deliberate, measured. The desert sun beat down, making the heat nearly unbearable, but they remained still, relying on skill and patience. The woman marveled at the cowboy's composure, his calm presence grounding her even as danger approached. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. "We move now. Stick close to me, follow my lead, and don't make a sound." They dropped down from the ridge and moved quietly along a narrow path that wound around the valley. The bandits had not noticed them yet, and every step was careful and precise. The woman kept close, watching the cowboy's movements, learning how he balanced caution with speed. They were a team, though unspoken, moving together with shared purpose and silent trust. As they advanced, one of the bandits spotted movement ahead. A shout rang out, and the figures turned, weapons raised. The cowboy acted instantly, grabbing the woman's arm and pulling her behind a boulder. Bullets whizzed past, striking the rock with sharp impacts. The woman's heart pounded in her chest, fear and adrenaline mixing in equal measure. "Stay down," he whispered, pressing her close. "We'll wait for the right moment." The bandits moved closer, scanning the terrain, unaware of the narrow path the two travelers could use to escape. The cowboy studied them carefully, noting their positions and movements. He had been in dangerous situations before, but never with another person relying on him. The responsibility weighed heavily. But he did not falter. After several tense minutes, he saw an opening, a small gap between two rocks that led to a hidden ravine. "Now," he said, and they moved swiftly, dropping down into the ravine. The bandits fired, but the rocks provided cover. Heart racing, the woman followed closely, trusting his knowledge of the desert. They moved quickly through the ravine, the rocks and shadows concealing them from the bandits' view. The sun burned overhead, but here the shade provided brief relief. They did not speak, each step measured and precise, knowing that any mistake could be dangerous. Eventually they emerged from the ravine onto a small plateau, safe for the moment. The bandits had lost track of them, and the woman allowed herself a deep breath, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing. She looked at the cowboy, gratitude and respect shining in her eyes. "You are amazing," she said quietly. "I don't know if I could have done that alone." He nodded, brushing dust from his clothes. "You would have managed," he replied, "but two heads are better than one, especially in the desert." For the first time since they had met, there was a sense of relief between them, though the danger was not entirely gone. They knew the desert would continue to challenge them, and that their journey was far from over. But in that moment, they had survived together, their trust in each other strengthened by shared danger. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they found a small sheltered spot to rest, hidden from view. The air cooled slightly, and the desert's harsh colors softened in the evening light. They ate a simple meal in silence, both lost in thought, reflecting on the day's events and the unexpected bond that had formed between them. The woman realized that the cowboy's warnings, his careful instructions, and his protective presence were not signs of hostility, but of experience, wisdom, and perhaps even kindness. And the cowboy, in turn, recognized her courage, determination, and ability to remain calm under pressure. They had faced danger together, and in doing so, had formed a connection that went beyond words, a connection forged in trust, respect, and shared survival. As night fell, stars filled the sky, and the desert grew quiet once more. The air cooled, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of distant wildflowers. The woman lay on the ground, staring up at the vast sky, feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. She knew the next day would bring more challenges, but for now, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The cowboy sat nearby, keeping watch, his rifle close at hand, alert to any signs of danger. Yet even in his vigilance, there was a quiet satisfaction, a sense that, for once, he was not entirely alone. In the harsh, unforgiving desert, moments of human connection were rare and precious, and this one, brief as it might be, was a reminder of the strength found in companionship. The sun rose slowly the next morning, casting soft golden light across the desert. The air was still cool, a relief after the heat of the previous day. The woman stirred first, sitting up and stretching her tired limbs. Her body ached from the long journey and the strain of carrying water, but her mind was alert, aware that the desert offered no guarantees. Every day here demanded attention, patience, and care. The cowboy was already awake, sitting nearby, scanning the horizon with sharp eyes. He had slept lightly, always alert to movement or signs of danger. The events of the previous day had reminded him of the unpredictability of the world beyond his homestead. For years he had lived in solitude, relying solely on his skills and instincts. Yet now, with another person beside him, he felt a strange mix of responsibility and connection. The woman was no longer just a stranger. She was someone he had protected, guided, and shared danger with. They packed their minimal belongings quietly, both understanding the unspoken rules of the desert. Words were few, but the understanding between them was deep. The woman adjusted her water containers, making sure they were secure, while the cowboy checked the path ahead. Even small mistakes could lead to trouble, and they were both careful to respect the desert's demands. As they moved forward, the landscape changed. The flat desert floor gave way to gentle hills, dotted with sparse vegetation and rocky outcroppings. The sun climbed higher, and the heat grew stronger, forcing them to slow their pace. Sweat ran down their backs, mixing with the dust that had accumulated during their long journey. Yet, they pressed on, driven by necessity and determination. The woman glanced at the cowboy. She had seen him face danger before without fear, yet now, as they navigated this harsh terrain together, she noticed a different side of him. There was caution, yes, but also thoughtfulness. He watched not only the path ahead but also her movements, ensuring she was safe. She realized that his warnings were not meant to control her, but to protect her, even if he struggled to express it directly. After several hours, they came across a shallow creek, a rare sight in this dry land. The water was clear and cool, reflecting the bright sky above. The woman let out a small sigh of relief, kneeling to drink, and filling her containers with care. The cowboy remained standing, scanning the surrounding area, as if the desert itself might send another test at any moment. "This will help us for the next stretch," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "Don't waste it." She nodded, appreciating both the water and his practical guidance. They rested briefly by the creek, sharing a simple meal of dried fruit and bread. There was silence, but it was comfortable. Dead. The desert had a way of stripping life down to essentials. Food, water, shelter, and trust. Words were less important than action, and both of them understood that deeply now. As they continued, the woman began to notice the cowboy's subtle signs of fatigue. Years of solitude had made him resilient, but even he was human. His movements were precise, but not hurried. His eyes scanned constantly, but there were moments when he paused, taking stock of both the landscape and himself. She felt a quiet concern, a desire to help, though she knew she could not speak too loudly about it. By mid-afternoon, they reached a rocky plateau, overlooking a valley that stretched for miles. The view was breathtaking, the desert rolling endlessly, dotted with patches of green and sparkling in the heat. But the beauty did not mask the danger. They both knew that the openness of the plateau could expose them to threats, whether human or natural. The cowboy gestured for her to sit behind a large boulder while he examined the edge of the plateau. "You have to understand," he said, crouching beside her. "This land isn't forgiving. It can be beautiful and cruel at the same time. You need to respect it, or it will teach you harsh lessons." She nodded, absorbing his words. She had already felt the desert's harshness and its unexpected kindness. In this quiet, open space, she began to understand why he lived here alone. It was not just survival. It was a way of being attuned to the world, noticing the small details that others overlooked, and learning patience, resilience, and awareness. Suddenly the wind shifted, carrying an unfamiliar sound, a faint crunching of stones, soft at first, then growing louder. The woman tensed, her heart racing. The cowboy's eyes narrowed, his body moving instinctively toward cover. They both crouched low, peering over the edge of the boulder, scanning the terrain below. A group of travelers appeared in the distance, moving steadily but carefully. They were not bandits this time, but another set of people crossing the desert. The cowboy studied them, noting their pace and behavior. He did not relax immediately. Even friendly strangers could be dangerous if trust was misplaced. "They're not hostile," he said finally, though his voice remained cautious. "Just travelers like us, but we need to keep our distance." The woman watched silently, impressed by his careful judgment. It was a skill born of experience. He could read people and the land in ways she was still learning. She realized that trust in the desert was earned through observation, patience, and shared experience, not words alone. As the group passed, the woman allowed herself a small smile, feeling a sense of relief. The cowboy remained watchful for a few more minutes, then relaxed slightly. "Let's keep moving," he said, rising carefully. "We've stayed too long in one place." They descended into the valley, the terrain becoming gentler, though still dotted with rocks and sparse vegetation. The sun beat down relentlessly, but they moved steadily, pausing occasionally for water and rest. Each step was deliberate, a careful balance of speed and caution. The desert demanded respect, and they both gave it willingly. By late afternoon, the woman noticed a subtle change in the cowboy's demeanor. There was a softness in his expression, a brief flicker of thoughtfulness that suggested he was reflecting on more than just survival. She decided to speak, her voice gentle. "Do you ever feel lonely out here?" He paused, looking at her carefully before answering. "Lonely?" he repeated slowly. "But loneliness isn't always bad. It teaches you who you are, what you can endure. Still, it's rare to meet someone who understands that without judgment." She nodded, understanding him better than she had expected. She knew something of solitude herself, though her reasons were different. In that shared silence they felt a quiet connection, not bound by words but by experience. It was the kind of understanding that the desert encouraged, a bond built on survival, observation, and trust. As evening approached, the light softened, turning the desert into a canvas of deep oranges, purples, and reds. They found a sheltered spot among some large rocks, hidden from view and partially shaded. The cowboys set up a small fire while the woman gathered what little wood they could find. They ate quietly, sharing the meal in companionship rather than conversation. The night settled in, cool and quiet, with the stars shining brighter than either had seen in years. Why? The desert's harshness softened under the vast sky, and for a moment the world felt both immense and intimate. They spoke little, but their silence was full of understanding. Each knew the other had faced danger, and each respected the strength and courage required to survive. The woman reflected on the cowboy's initial warning from the first night: get water from the well and leave by dawn. She understood it now more deeply. It had not been a simple instruction. It had been care expressed in the only way he knew, a protection born of experience and caution. And she felt grateful, not just for the water or the warning, but for the trust and guidance he had offered in a world that often overlooked her. The cowboy, in turn, reflected on her courage. She had followed him without complaint, learned quickly, and remained calm under pressure. In a land that demanded toughness and awareness, she had proven herself capable. He felt a quiet pride, unusual for him, in having someone at his side who could match his knowledge and determination. As they settled for the night, the fire crackling softly between them, there was a sense of calm after the day's tension. The desert could be cruel, but it could also offer moments of connection, teaching that even in isolation, people could find companionship and understanding. Both felt the weight of the journey ahead, but for the first time they knew they could face it together. And as sleep approached, with the cool air brushing against their faces and the stars standing guard above, they both felt a quiet certainty. The desert was still challenging, still unforgiving, but they had each other's strength to rely on. It was a small victory, but meaningful, a reminder that even in harsh places, trust and human connection could endure. The next morning came quietly, with soft light stretching across the desert like a gentle promise. The sky was clear, pale blue, and the air carried a faint chill from the night. The woman woke first, brushing sand from her clothes and stretching tired muscles. Her journey had been long, and the weight of the water she carried made her movements slower than usual. But there was also a quiet pride in her posture. She had endured the desert's trials, faced danger, and learned lessons that would stay with her forever. The cowboy was already awake, sitting near the small fire they had built the night before. He had watched the horizon as the first light of dawn crept over the desert. His rifle lay nearby, and his eyes scanned the terrain out of habit, alert to any potential threat. Yet there was a calmness to him now, a subtle relief that the night had passed without incident. He glanced at the woman and saw the same quiet resolve in her, the kind that came from surviving hardship and learning to trust, if only briefly, another human being. They prepared to move, packing their meager belongings carefully. The desert was unforgiving, but it had also been a teacher, shaping their understanding of patience, caution, and resilience. Each step was deliberate, measured, and mindful. The woman balanced her water containers on her shoulders, aware of the value of every drop, while the cowboy led the way, scanning the trail and marking potential hazards. "Where will you go after this?" he asked, his voice soft, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since early morning. The woman paused, considering her answer. "Back to the settlements," she said finally. "I have people to check on, supplies to deliver, but I'll carry what I've learned here with me." The cowboy nodded, understanding. He had spent so many years alone that he had almost forgotten the value of connection. Her words reminded him that life could move forward, even after solitude, danger, and hardship. He did not speak of his own next steps. Instead, he allowed her journey to be hers, knowing that the desert had taught them both lessons that would endure far beyond this shared experience. As they walked along the trail, the desert revealed its quiet beauty in the morning light. Rocks shimmered with warm tones, distant cliffs cast long shadows, and the faint scent of wildflowers drifted through the air. The woman took in the landscape, letting herself feel gratitude for the small wonders the desert offered. Each step was a reminder of endurance, patience, and the value of observing the world carefully. Hours passed, and the path began to slope downward toward a small valley. Here the sand was softer, dotted with low shrubs and scattered stones. The woman moved carefully, aware of her energy, while the cowboy continued to scan the horizon, his alertness never fully relaxed. Danger could appear at any moment, even now, but they were prepared and patient, understanding that survival was often a matter of observation and timing rather than speed or strength alone. At one point, the woman stumbled on a loose rock, nearly losing her balance. The cowboy reacted instantly, catching her arm and steadying her. "Careful," he said quietly. "These small mistakes can be dangerous out here." She looked at him, grateful, and nodded. "Thank you," she said simply, realizing how much his guidance had meant during their journey. It was not just about safety. It was about trust. She had learned to rely on him in a way that was rare for her, and he had allowed her to step into that reliance without judgment. By midday, they reached the edge of a small spring, a hidden oasis tucked between rocks and sparse trees. The water sparkled in the sun, clear and inviting. The woman knelt immediately, taking a long, grateful drink. She filled her containers, careful not to spill a single drop. The cowboy remained nearby, watching, his own lips pressed into a thin line as he evaluated the surroundings. Even in a place of seeming safety, he remained alert, a habit formed from years of living alone in the desert. "This will help you for the rest of your journey," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Make sure you pace yourself. Don't waste energy, and don't push too hard." She smiled faintly, understanding the care behind his words. "I will," she replied. "You've taught me more than I expected." There was a pause between them, a quiet moment in which the desert seemed to hold its breath. The wind whispered softly, rustling the leaves of the small trees near the spring. In that silence, both of them reflected on the journey they had shared. It had begun with a simple warning, almost brusque in tone, but it had evolved into a mutual understanding and respect that neither had anticipated. They had faced danger, endured the harshness of the desert, and relied on each other's skills and instincts to survive. She looked at the cowboy, a mixture of gratitude, respect, and unspoken emotion in her eyes.
"I should go now," she said softly.
"I need to get back to the settlements before nightfall." The cowboy nodded, his face calm but thoughtful. "I understand," he said. "The desert is safe enough for now, but it's not forgiving. You know the way."
She took a step forward, then paused, unsure how to express the depth of her appreciation.
"Thank you," she said again, more earnestly this time. "Not just for the water, but for everything. For watching out for me, for teaching me." He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You've learned well," he said, "and you've been strong. That's enough." They exchanged no further words. The silence between them was comfortable, carrying weight without need for expression. In a land as vast and harsh as the desert, actions often spoke louder than words, and the bond they had formed over the past days had been built on those very actions. Trust, cooperation, courage, and respect. The woman began walking down the trail, her steps steady and measured. The cowboy watched her go, standing tall, a solitary figure against the wide expanse of the desert. The sun glinted off his hat as he shaded his eyes, following her progress until she disappeared behind a curve in the path. He remained there for a while, letting the quiet of the desert wash over him, reflecting on the rare moments of connection that had entered his life. As she walked, the woman looked back once, catching a glimpse of the cowboy standing alone. She smiled faintly, carrying the memory of his guidance, protection, and companionship with her. The journey ahead would be long, but the lessons she had learned, the patience, vigilance, and quiet courage, would remain with her, guiding her steps and strengthening her resolve. The sun climbed higher, the shadows shortening, and the desert seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The woman moved forward with purpose, water balanced carefully, her mind focused on the settlements and the responsibilities awaiting her. Yet the memory of the cowboy, the homestead, and the small moments of trust and understanding lingered in her heart. They had shared something rare, fleeting but meaningful, and it would stay with her long after the desert faded from view. By late afternoon, she reached a small ridge overlooking the distant settlements. Smoke rose faintly from chimneys, and the sound of voices carried faintly on the wind. Relief filled her chest as she realized she had made it this far safely. The desert had tested her, challenged her, and taught her lessons she would never forget. She had survived the harsh sun, the sudden storms, the potential dangers, and she had done so with the guidance and companionship of someone who had known the land far longer than she had. Meanwhile, the cowboy returned to his homestead. The boards creaked under his boots as he stepped onto the porch, the familiar weight of solitude settling over him once more. Yet it was different now. He carried with him the knowledge that another person had walked with him, shared his vigilance, respected his warnings, and endured the desert beside him. Even in his solitude there was a sense of connection that lingered, a subtle warmth in the vast empty landscape. As evening fell, painting the desert in deep oranges and purples, he tended to his small garden and animals, performing routine tasks with the quiet rhythm of a life lived in careful observation. And though he was alone again, he did not feel entirely empty. The presence of the woman, brief as it had been, had left an imprint, a reminder that even in isolation, human lives could intersect meaningfully, and that trust, kindness, and understanding could exist even in the harshest of places. The woman, walking toward the settlements, felt a renewed sense of confidence and resilience. The desert had tested her, challenged her, and shown her the importance of patience, caution, and courage. She knew that life would continue to present obstacles, but she carried with her the knowledge that survival was possible, that trust could be earned, and that even brief connections could leave a lasting impact. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, both the cowboy and the woman paused in their respective places. They had shared a journey through danger, heat, and uncertainty, and in doing so, had learned something about themselves and each other. It was a bond that would endure in memory, a quiet proof of human resilience, courage, and connection in a world that often seemed vast and indifferent. And with that thought, the desert settled into night, quiet and calm, leaving behind only the traces of two travelers who had crossed paths, survived together, and parted ways carrying something neither would ever forget.